Welcome everybody to the Principia podcast. I'm Mitch.
I'm Jake.
And what are we talking about today?
Well, to start off, we're going to start off with a icebreaker question. So, question we have been pondering before we started is, if you had to have one meal for the rest of your life, would you rather have it be a dinner meal or a breakfast meal? So, for me, my answer was steak and mashed potatoes. I could probably eat for the rest of my entire life, so I would choose the dinner option.
While I do appreciate steak and mashed potatoes, I do also appreciate pastas and things like that. So I'm going to have to politely disagree and say that breakfast. I also pretty much already do that. I eat eggs and toast like every day. Sometimes I spice it up with some avocado toast or anything that can make me more hip with the crowd, you know?
Yeah, thanks for throwing that in there. As long as you're drinking cold-pressed organic.
Yeah, always cold-pressed organic and hemp seed extract and everything. And I dab a little bit of CBD oil on my eyebrows every morning.
Maximum absorption.
Yeah.
Good. So that's a little insight to us. What we want to talk to you guys about today is our workshop. So in particular, our flexibility mobility workshop. We have finished one up today, and we're just really excited for what this has to offer, and just wanted to bring some insight and highlight some things for you guys. So I guess the first question, Mitch, is how do I know that I'm ready to take a step in the direction to doing a workshop or getting in a CrossFit gym? Maybe some people are saying, you said the word CrossFit and my back immediately started hurting. Or I've heard that that's bad for your shoulders. How would we give some insight into that?
Yeah, so I mean, anytime that you're going to take on a new fitness lifestyle, whether it's CrossFit or not, there are definitely some parameters that you need to set for yourself. And our workshop really helps fully define those parameters for each individual and how they're different for each individual, and allows them to really understand what their body is like and how they should not be moving past that until they are fully ready for it. So it really just is setting those parameters. But anytime you take on something new, you run a little bit more risk. Like if you're always on the couch and you decide to not always be on the couch, there is more risk in just that step right there.
Right.
So it's no different than any of those things. It does take some progression to get into things. I wouldn't say that, if you're looking at CrossFit on YouTube or the CrossFit Games and watching that and you think that's what you're going to do, you're wrong. You're not going to do anywhere near that, especially day one. In fact, on a day-to-day basis, 99.9% of people really aren't doing that on a day-to-day basis. It's really just those games competitors that have made the sport their life. This is not the sport that makes our life. This is just the fitness style that enables our life. Totally different idea.
They're elite athletes. It'd be like watching the Olympics for the 100-meter dash and then just assuming that, all right, I'm training to be Usain Bolt.
Right, yeah. You just assume that you're going to do Usain Bolt's same program and you're going to get the same results. That's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's not the same in that regard. In fact, we would never have you do the same as a CrossFit Games athlete in our gym coming out of, we don't know you. Go through the workshop, we'll find out what you're capable of a little bit.
Right. So good. That's important. We've already touched on a couple things, but just to kind of nail down that first step, when we come in, or when you guys come in to the workshop, that very first step, what does that look like?
So the way we start our workshop off with is by putting everybody's goals into perspective. Okay, so we have a process that we do that. Basically, I'm just going around and asking the room, like, why is fitness important to you? Why do you do fitness? What do you want out of fitness? Those kinds of questions to start getting, not only does it start getting some conversations going, but it starts giving us some typically 1 to 3 word answers that we could write down on a board. I write down all the answers and I don't direct anybody towards answers or away from answers. I just write them down as they say them. I may reformat them as long as it's consistent with what they're saying and meaning. And I make sure I ask so I'm not like stepping on their toes and changing what they're saying. So I ask those questions, I write them all down on the board, and then I break it down into 3 different categories: health, ego, and performance.
Okay.
Then we just take those answers and we put them under health, ego, performance. So far, what I've seen is very few people actually have anything under performance at all. So far, there's not been a single one that has put any whys or goals on the board that have resonated with performance. Nobody's actually looking for a stronger deadlift. Nobody's actually looking for a better Fran time, if you don't know what the world of Fran is. Nobody's looking for a better 100-meter sprint time. They're not specific like that. They're mainly looking for looking good, feeling good, being able to live longer, more quality of life, that sort of thing.
Right.
But it's important. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think a lot of people can get turned off by looking at the CrossFit Games athletes, for instance. And the cool thing about what we do is right off the bat, we're already showing that that's not the way that we're headed immediately. Very first thing, what are your goals? If it's not in line to be on that elite level, then that's over here, and your goals are aligned within that health and ego usually is what you've seen.
Yes. Now, and I guess there should be some clarity around ego. It has a bad connotation, but it shouldn't, because ego is very important. So your ability to get up in front of your coworkers and give a speech about something that you have the specialty in is very important to be able to do that. And if you lack confidence or ego, then you're going to convey that when you speak to them, which means they're less likely to listen, which means your specialty, your niche, and whatever your job is, whatever strength that you're giving your career is already limited in its potential because you're unable to access the part of your ego that will allow you to convey a message confidently. Right. And that's just one instance of it. But ego is very healthy if you have the right amount of it, but it can turn on you as well.
Cool. So I think now that we've differentiated right off the bat, for most people, we're not chasing a performance goal. So we're highlighting in those areas of health and ego, looking at longevity, that we want confidence in different areas of our lives, and just highlighting that the way that we operate as a gym can affect all those areas. So now that we have some goals in perspective, how do we understand what the next priority should be? We've got our goals, the next step. What is that?
So in the workshop, it's all based on flexibility mobility because that's step one. Okay, so that's where we start, and that's the priority. If you don't have the passive range of motion to get your shoulder or get your arm in an overhead position, then doing all these active range of motions that demand that there's no other way to do the movement unless you go into that range of motion becomes incredibly unsafe. Right? So like I think of doing like pull-up hanging from a bar. If you physically have pain when your arm is overhead already, and then you go and add your body weight to that and you start cranking on it and things like that, you're asking for some shoulder injuries potentially, right? It kind of goes the same with picking things up off the floor. If you already, without any weight, can't bend over and touch the floor as it is with your knees locked out, then there's definitely some limited capacity for picking anything up off the floor because you're already in pain without it, or you already can't reach the floor. So when we ask you to be able to do that, or we have movements that force that, right? Or if, let's say like the deadlift, for instance, a lot of people put their knees forward in the deadlift, which puts the load into their quads so that they can get lower without actually having to keep their knees relatively straight. And all they're really doing is making the demand on their stability of the pelvis, so keeping their back flat basically, entirely up to their lats, their back stabilizers, so all those lower back muscles, as well as their quadriceps to stabilize their hip.
Right.
But the hamstring is kind of bypassed in that. And the hamstring is on that back side, and when you're bending over, you're going to need that back side to be completely turned on so that you have a good even spread of stabilization over your pelvis. Right. So back injuries and deadlifts are very common because people have that tendency to do that, right? But we can screen for that tendency before we ever even have them touch a barbell or even consider, you're not even looking at a barbell at that point. I also want to make sure I just go back really quick and just make sure that we understand that we're not saying chasing performance is bad. It's just we have to have an understanding that if that's not your why, then you should not be doing that.
Right.
So what we tend to see in this more competitive class atmosphere is people getting outside of their lane, which is why we bring that why in right up front, right? We get the why down, and now they know, okay, well, my lane is health. I'm going to stay in my lane. Staying in my lane in health means moving slower in this workout today. It means doing a dumbbell version of the movement instead of doing a barbell version of the movement, right? So now they no longer can compete because they're no longer holding the same standard as everybody else. Right?
Good.
That's
good.
them staying in their lane. Same thing with the ego and performance. Like, we just want to make sure everybody's in their lane. So we try to get them to identify which lane is theirs so we can help them stay in their lane. Does that make more sense?
Yep.
So we're not saying like performance is bad. I do think that our members are mainly focused on health and a little bit of that healthy ego as well. But we're very few members chasing like a deadlift max or 100-meter sprint time or, in our world, Fran time. Very few.
That's good to highlight.
Yeah.
So now that we've focused a little bit on that flexibility and mobility, so if we're building a base and that's the bottom of the base, what comes next on that?
Yeah, so this workshop, again, really just focuses on those, but when we do the next workshop, and the next workshop is strength balance. So we're looking at, can you push and pull with the same amount of weight? Can you, does your squat to deadlift ratio make sense, I guess? We have numbers, specific percentages that we want to hit. So as an exact example, we want your back squat to be 80% of your deadlift-ish, right? There's some breathing room there. And it also depends on the goals. So like if your goal is to be an Olympic lifter, it's less important to have that 80% true. But we know for health and longevity, that 80% does need to be highlighted. So if you have the same deadlift as you do a back squat, then you're going to be one of those people who we want to take out of just regular CrossFit day to day and say, hey, let's focus a little bit more on this hinge pattern so that we can avoid any pain in the lower back or whatever, because the hinge pattern is just going to continue getting weaker while the squat pattern continues getting stronger, which then we're back to that being stronger on one side of our body versus the other side of our body can potentially pull joints out of whack.
Right.
And that's the same with, we'll test side to side too. Can your right arm press the same amount of weight as your left arm for the same amount of reps? Can your left leg step up the same amount of times as your right leg with the same amount of weight on the front rack, right? We do all those tests so that we can separate joint by joint if they're structurally balanced as far as strength goes.
Okay.
Not mobility or flexibility, because we already did that in the base, right?
So that's good. Really to highlight that flexibility and mobility really being the base. So that's why this is the first workshop that we offer, and that is the one that's going to give us a lot of data on how to continue up to those next levels.
Yeah.
So now that we've kind of addressed what are my goals, what's my why am I here, why have I decided to sign up for this thing, and then looking at, well, what are my priorities and where do I begin in figuring those things out? How do I know how much I can handle, and where, with that common mindset of like, oh, people who do CrossFit may have a higher chance of injuring their shoulders. How do I know when I'm stepping in that realm of pain and when injury could potentially be happening? Yeah,
so we have a brief, and you can look it up on YouTube if you want, load versus capacity on our Principia CrossFit channel. But it's basically how much load is not just what you're doing in the gym, it's everything in life, versus how much capacity. Our goal as coaches is to make sure that everybody's capacity is raised by doing more fitness, right? So we can raise your cardiovascular capacity, we can raise your strength numbers, we can raise all those things, sure. But we also want to understand what's all the things in the athlete's control that can be fixed, or what's all the things with our guidance, our expertise, that we can be minimizing risk in front of that, right? So what I mean by that is when people come in, they have their anatomical deficiencies. That's things like, I've had surgery on my shoulder. We're not going to make an impact on what happened on a surgical level. That's not something we're capable of. There's scar tissue buildup, joints are shaped differently, bones are shaped differently. Sometimes if there's a bone deficiency, we don't handle that, right? The doctors handle that, surgeons handle that. Sometimes physical therapists and chiropractors can handle some of those things. But what we can do is muscular and tendon health, right? So I lost my train of thought. What was the question? Oh, injury and how it happens. So basically, the common issue that people are having is they do the workout, and let's say it had back squats in it, and then They did one back squat, didn't feel right. All of a sudden, they're kind of in pain, but they continue through the workout, and the pain doesn't go away for weeks. So then they go, I'm going to go to the doctor and get it checked out. And the doctor says, oh, it's awesome. Just don't do back squats anymore because that's what caused the pain, right? So what we're trying to do is make sure that people understand that the back squat's not what caused the pain. There's all these other things, like those anatomical things that I just mentioned, and then you get into stress, diet, and sleep.
Sure.
Right? So when you're talking about stress, diet, and sleep, it's your body's ability to recover. It's the hormonal balance, right? Trying to achieve homeostasis, things like that. If you're not sleeping enough, you're at a significant disadvantage. If you're not eating enough or the right things, you're at a significant disadvantage, right? And if you're stressed out all the time because of your work, whatever it might be, you're at a significant disadvantage, right? So now you're talking about, as far as your load, those things all just incrementally increase your load depending on how severe they are. So if I get 3 hours of sleep, I can expect my load to be significantly higher at the start of my day already. Right? Same thing with stress. If I know I have a really important thing coming up, maybe my training needs to take a back seat so that I can be really focused on that and get over it before I go back into training full speed again. Right? So things like that weigh heavily. And then next step is functional diagnosis. That's where we, at Principia especially, have the training to identify these things. That's where the flexibility and mobility comes in. That's where the strength balance comes in. That's where your work to recovery ability comes in, right? That's all of those things compile your functional diagnosis, which is the stuff that we're trying to help people get an understanding of with this workshop so that they can understand how to curb things. So that they have more load that they're able to tolerate, so more capacity. Right up front without needing to do more fitness first.
Yeah, that's good. That's, I think, something that isn't considered a lot, you know. If you're looking to maybe do something like lose weight and you're just like, well, all I need to do is exercise, and in a way, it's taking a little bit of a step back and saying, let's look at some other things first. Let's see what is in our control, and let's see how much these are actually affecting how well we'll be able to perform in here. So setting realistic expectations for what we can do.
Yeah, and I think by perform, you mean like move to a full range of motion, not move as fast as possible or as much weight as possible, but move to a full range of motion with control.
Yeah, without pain and all of those things associated with it as well. Cool. So now that we've kind of gotten into a little bit about functional diagnosis, do we want to go into kind of what that assessment looks like and kind of what that means for the fitness for an individual? So what do we do for the shoulder? What do we do for hips, just as far as, do we check those things?
What our how our screens work?
Yeah, just in a rough sense, what is the screening like?
Yeah, so we take you through several upper body screens, several lower body screens. And let's say an individual has a common reoccurrence. Maybe they're not experiencing it right now, but they have a recurring back pain issue, let's say. It's probably the easiest one to talk about because 70% of the population has low back pain at some point in their life, right? So if that's the case, we can break down their assessment for their lower body, especially, in some cases, some of the upper body, and identify what is the potential cause of the problem and how can we treat it from a movement perspective instead of going to see a doctor necessarily. And again, I mean, we're not replacing physical therapy. If there is a strong need for that or it's a severe need for that, physical therapy is where you start, where physical therapy leaves you. Right, so that's kind of where you're left off there. Same thing with chiropractors. They can make a great adjustment and instantaneous relief. But if you want the long-lasting change, you need to change the way it happened in the first place.
All right, that's good.
Right, so the assessment is screening for like posterior chain flexibility. Right, so can you reach down and touch the floor with your knees locked out? What that will tell us is what is your capacity like for pulling anything off the floor, right? It can also tell us if your sciatic nerve is at risk, right? It can tell us if your low back's at risk right then and there without going any further, right? And if that's all doesn't fail for somebody, but they do experience back pain, then we go into other tests. So then we can go into the front side of the hip and go into our prone heel to butt tests, right? Where we're testing the core's communication with their anterior chain, things like their quads and hip flexors, and how those two communicate together. We can see that in that screen a little bit. And then if we see a fault there, and they experience back pain, we know how to speak to that person about what could be a potential reason for that recurring back pain. And it goes even further. Like you can go down the chain all the way to the ankles. A lot of people take their ankles for granted, but if you lack range of motion in your ankle, there's so many compensations of movement that the body naturally will go to, where you don't feel any different. You don't feel like it's a problem. You don't feel any pain, but your ankle is actually causing your back to hurt, right? Because you lack that range of motion, so your body goes upstream. And then if that next joint lacks range of motion, it's going to go upstream again. And if that lacks range of motion, it's going to go upstream.
Right. So that's kind of the key there is we're isolating each one of those joint by joint and checking up and down the stream, seeing where breakdown is occurring.
Correct. Yeah. We're just trying to identify where the immobilities and inflexibilities are potentially causing movement pattern adjustments so that we know what movements that we either need to avoid or go into with an extra focus and attention.
Good. So I think that segues kind of into the next part. So now we've begun to understand why we're doing what we're doing. We know a little more about what is it that we actually need. We've put some time and thought into what is my actual load and how much capacity do I have as an individual throughout my whole life, not just in a gym setting. And taking into account those things, we've done an assessment. So now we know joint by joint, some places where we may have compensation that could be leading to pain that we've been feeling for a long time. Now that we know all those things, what's the next step? How do we take all that information that we've just gained and how do we apply it?
And so during the workshop and after each assessment, before each assessment, when we're telling you what the assessment is and what it looks like before we go into that particular joint, we're also saying what movements are impacted by it too. So people know that this is important to listen to if you're experiencing this or if you want to do this movement or things like that, right? So a good example would be on that ankle one, let's say. If you squat and it looks like you fold yourself in half and your hip actually doesn't go that low, it might be because your knee doesn't go forward enough in a squat, right? So things like that. Or if you're experiencing ankle, knee, hip pain during squatting or running or jumping movements, and then if they go, oh, I'm in all of those, then it's like, then this might be special for you to pay attention to. Did that answer the question? I feel like there was another part of it.
Yeah, so that's part of it. Just like, so now I've got this information. I found out, wow, my ankle's lacking a lot of range of motion, and I had no idea. So just applying things like that. So we've gone through the whole screen. So let's say
right. So like now we go into like that workout. We usually take people through a workout in it. And in that workout is when you're going to apply everything you learned, right? And obviously we're there to help guide that application, but it's like we'll take a squatting movement and adjust it for that person's body. Right. Based off of the findings that they found and they wrote down on a sheet of paper.
Right. So they should feel drastically different by the time they finish this workout. And
absolutely. Like a lot of people, like when we did it today, I was really impressed with, there was at least 3 people that you could tell something completely clicked and they were moving in a way that I've never seen them move with all the coaching cues in the world. And all it is just they have a good understanding of what joints are moving which way and which movements that applies to. Yeah. And now they've changed it. And all of a sudden, I saw people moving full range of motion that I've never seen with great quality that I've never seen. And I wasn't really fully expecting that myself, even though I know the power of knowing your body very much. But it was still really impressive to see some of that. So that would be how we apply it, is we do that workout. And then we reflect on how that workout went to identify, like, was that different? Was it truly different? And if it wasn't, let's talk about it. Because it is important that if that didn't solve any of those problems, maybe we do need to go into strength balance, right? Or there's the rare case where somebody passes all the flexibility, mobility things, but they still have recurring pains. And it's like, okay, cool. Let's go into strength balance testing next, where you can identify those things and tackle those.
Yeah, I think taking the time to accurately reflect, okay, what are all these new things that I just learned? And now I've began to understand some things I never knew about myself, the way my body's been moving for years, weeks, months. Taking the time to reflect on what does this mean for my life and where I'm at now is really important. So, guys, we only have one body, and really our time is short. And for a lot of people, we're living in a place where we experience pain, and you may feel like you just have to live with that. We're here to tell you that you don't have to chronically deal with pain and doing very simple movements like getting up out of a chair or getting out of a car, or if you're playing with your kids and your knees always hurt if you're down with them, or lifting them up, or you're on an airplane and you just want to put your suitcase overhead. Guys, that doesn't have to hurt and cause discomfort every single time that you do that. So we just wanted to give you guys some information about what we do and ways that we can help you guys identify those things and move forward so that we can solve these issues for you guys long term, so that this becomes something as a distant thought, and before long you've forgotten that you even had pain when you did that.
Yeah, I think to just elaborate or take it a step further, pain physically will cause mental, emotional, spiritual stress as well.
Yeah.
So it's important to recognize that, yeah, your pain is easy to deal with, but does it make you short with your wife and kids or husband and kids, right? Does it make your sex drive go down? Does it decrease your quality of life, period? In ways that it's not necessarily a physical thing anymore, right? We're talking about what it does mentally to us as well. So it's important to understand that all of these realms are intertwined as far as mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, whatever. We need to make sure that people understand that and are fully aware that their physical pain may be causing more pain elsewhere. Cool?
Yeah, that's good.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been the Principia CrossFit podcast. Feel free to share this with anybody who you think needs to hear it. Check us out on Instagram. I'm the real White Iverson, I think. The real _ White Iverson or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Can't be too many.
Yeah, yeah. And that's not like a white person thing. My last name's Iverson. All right. So there was that song. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, and mine is jakeo'reilly.co. And guys, let's win it back.